April 17, 1945. The air above a field hospital in Bad Kreuznach near the Rhine smells of disinfectant and damp wool. Rain taps softly against canvas stretched over wooden frames. Inside the makeshift ward, 37 German nurses move between rows of wounded men boys, really whose faces are pale beneath layers of grime and fatigue. The women's hands are raw from lye soap. Their aprons, once white, are now the color of rust and mud. Outside, the rumble of truck engines signals the arrival of something unfamiliar. The war, for these women, has been a procession of retreats, shortages, and silences. They do not expect gifts. They do not expect kindness. They expect orders, occupation, and the cold arithmetic of defeat. When the American soldiers step through the tent flaps, they bring with them something the nurses have not seen in years: abundance. Not just food or medicine, though those come too, but small glass bottles wrapped in paper, each one containing a liquid that catches the gray light filtering through the canvas. Perfume, French perfume. Chanel No. 5. Le Her Bleu. Joy. The nurses stare. One woman, her hair pinned beneath a kerchief stiff with old starch, reaches out as if the bottle might vanish. Her fingers tremble. She unscrews the cap, and the scent jasmine, rose, sandalwood fills the tent like a memory of a world that no longer exists. For a moment, war pauses. The ideology that told these women they were superior, that their sacrifices were noble, that their enemies were barbaric, fractures in the presence of the small, absurd generosity. This moment, repeated in dozens of field hospitals, prison camps, and liberated towns across Germany in the spring of 1945, was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate collision between two worldviews, one built on scarcity, discipline, and mythic destiny, the other on abundance, pragmatism, and a belief that even in war, humanity could be preserved through small acts of decency. The perfume was not just perfume. It was a message, written in scent and glass, about what kind of country America believed itself to be. To understand why a bottle of perfume could stun a German nurse into silence, one must first understand what she had been taught to expect. From the moment the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland in September 1939, German women on the home front were told that their enemy, first the French and British, then the Soviets, and finally the Americans, represented moral and material decay. Nazi propaganda painted the Allies, and especially the Americans, as degenerate, ruled by Jews and Negroes, incapable of discipline or sacrifice. When Heinrich Himmler spoke to SS officers about the coming invasion, he warned them that American soldiers were mongrels who would loot, rape, and destroy. German nurses, many of whom had trained under the auspices of the Nazi Party's healthcare apparatus, absorbed these lessons. They were told they served a superior civilization. They were told their enemies were subhuman. And yet, by April 1945, that civilization lay in ruins. The nurses who moved through the field hospitals of the collapsing Reich had witnessed the unraveling firsthand. Food rations, once meager, had become non-existent. Soap was a luxury. Bandages were washed and reused until they disintegrated. The wounded soldiers they tended were no longer the blonde gods of Leni Riefenstahl's films, but gaunt, lice-ridden boys who whispered for their mothers in the night. The ideology that had promised them glory had delivered only hunger and ash. When the Americans arrived, the nurses expected violence. They expected punishment. They did not expect perfume. The American soldiers who distributed those bottles were, in many cases, ordinary men, farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, clerks from Brooklyn. They had crossed an ocean and a continent to fight a war they barely understood, driven by a mixture of duty, fear, and a vague sense that they were stopping something monstrous. But they had also been raised in a country that, even in the depths of the Great Depression, possessed a material wealth that dwarfed anything Europe had known. They had grown up with electric lights, indoor plumbing, automobiles, and supermarkets stocked with goods from every corner of the globe. When they arrived in Europe, they brought that abundance with them. Not just tanks and bombers, but chocolate bars, cigarettes, nylon stockings, and yes, perfume. The perfume itself had a history. Much of it had been looted by the Germans during their occupation of France. When American forces liberated Paris in August 1944, they found warehouses filled with luxury goods the Nazis had intended to ship back to Germany or sell on the black market. Perfume, that most frivolous and feminine of commodities, became a symbol of French resistance and German greed. American soldiers, with their pockets full of francs and their duffel bags light, bought bottles by the dozen. Some sent them home to sweethearts and wives. Others kept them as souvenirs, and some, in a gesture that would have baffled their commanders, gave them to the enemy. The decision to give perfume to German nurses was not ordered by any general or sanctioned by any policy. It emerged spontaneously from the strange intimacy of occupation. American medics and soldiers, arriving at field hospitals to treat wounded prisoners or coordinate the care of displaced persons, found themselves face to face with women who looked like their mothers or sisters. These were not the fanatics of the SS or the bureaucrats who had run the camps. They were exhausted, frightened civilians who had been caught in the machinery of a regime they may or may not have believed in. The Americans, for all their training in combat, had not been trained to hate on a personal level. They had been trained to shoot at uniforms, not faces. When they saw the nurses' raw hands and hollow eyes, something in them recoiled from the official narrative of collective guilt. They reached into their packs and pulled out the bottles. The nurses' reactions were recorded in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. One woman, a 32-year-old named Greta Hoffman, wrote in her diary, "I thought they would treat us like animals. Instead, they treated us like women." Another, Anna Schultz, recalled in a 1982 interview, "When the soldier handed me the perfume, I didn't know what to do. I hadn't seen perfume in 4 years. I thought it was a trick, that he would take it back and laugh. But he just smiled and walked away. I cried for an hour." A third nurse, whose name was lost to history, was quoted in a 1947 Red Cross report. "It was the first time I realized that maybe we had been lied to. If these were the barbarians we had been warned about, then what did that make us?" The perfume became a symbol not just of abundance, but of a different kind of power. The Nazi regime had built its legitimacy on the promise of strength through sacrifice. Germans were told to endure hardship because hardship forged character. Butter was less important than guns. Comfort was bourgeois decadence. Victory would come to those who could suffer the longest. But here were the Americans, who had won the war while still producing enough perfume to give it away. They had not sacrificed their humanity to achieve victory. They had, in fact, preserved it. The perfume whispered a dangerous idea, that abundance and decency were not incompatible, that a society could be both strong and kind. This was not the first time American abundance had shocked the Axis powers. When German soldiers captured American positions in North Africa and later in France, they were stunned by what they found. One Wehrmacht soldier, writing home in 1943, described raiding an American supply depot. "They have everything: canned fruit, chocolate, cigarettes, even ice cream. Ice cream in the middle of a war. We found a machine that makes coffee and another that heats water for shaving. These are not soldiers, these are tourists." The letter was later intercepted by Allied intelligence and filed as evidence of German morale problems. Japanese soldiers had similar experiences when they overran American positions in the Philippines in 1942. They found supplies that seemed almost obscene in their quantity. But by 1944, as the tide turned and American forces retook island after island, Japanese prisoners reported a kind of existential vertigo. One captured soldier interrogated on Saipan said through a translator, "We were told you were weak, that you could not fight because you were soft. But you have more of everything, more food, more bullets, more machines. How can you be soft when you have so much?" The interrogator noted in his report, subject seemed less concerned with his own fate than with the realization that his officers had lied to him. For the German nurses, the perfume was the crystallization of that realization. It was not just that the Americans had more, it was that they had more and still chose to be generous. Generosity, in the calculus of total war, made no sense. It was inefficient. It benefited the enemy. And yet here it was, in a glass bottle that fit in the palm of a hand. The nurses could not reconcile the perfume with the propaganda they had absorbed. If the Americans were supposed to be soulless capitalists, why were they giving away luxury goods for free? If they were supposed to be brutal occupiers, why did they smile when handing over the bottles? If they were supposed to be racially inferior, why did they seem so normal? The symbolic weight of the perfume was amplified by its contrast with what the nurses had experienced under their own regime. In Nazi Germany, scarcity was weaponized. Rationing was not just a necessity, but a tool of control. The regime decided who ate and who went hungry, who received medical care and who did not. The nurses themselves had been part of that system. Many had participated in the T4 euthanasia program, which murdered disabled children and adults deemed life unworthy of life. Others had worked in facilities where foreign laborers and prisoners of war received minimal care while German civilians were prioritized. The ideology of scarcity demanded constant triage, constant judgment about who deserved to live. The perfume, by contrast, suggested a world where there was enough for everyone, where giving did not require taking from someone else. This was the deeper message encoded in the bottles. The democracy and abundance were linked. The Americans did not just have more because of geography or luck. They had more because their system, messy, chaotic, often unjust, nonetheless, allowed for a level of productivity and innovation that authoritarian regimes could not match. The Soviet Union, despite its propaganda about proletarian paradise, could barely feed its own troops. Nazi Germany, despite its vaunted efficiency, had to loot occupied territories to sustain itself. Only the United States could afford to wage a global war while still manufacturing perfume, chewing gum, and Coca-Cola. The nurses, of course, did not think in such abstract terms. For them, the perfume was personal. It was the scent of a life they had lost or never had. It was a reminder that they were women, not just cogs in a war machine. It was a moment of recognition from an enemy who, by all rights, should have despised them. And for some, it was the beginning of a reckoning. If the Americans could be kind to them despite everything, then perhaps the stories they had been told about the world were wrong. Perhaps the war had not been a noble struggle, but a catastrophic mistake. Perhaps they, who had believed themselves to be on the side of history, had been on the wrong side all along. Not every nurse experienced this transformation. Some accepted the perfume with gratitude, but remained convinced that Germany had been betrayed rather than defeated. Others saw the gesture as condescending, a way for the victors to flaunt their superiority. But many found themselves changed. In the months and years after the war, as Germany was occupied and denazified, these women became part of a generation that had to rebuild not just their country, but their understanding of themselves. The perfume sitting on a shelf or tucked into a drawer became a talisman of that process. Every time they caught its scent, they were reminded of the moment when their certainties dissolved. The American soldiers who distributed the perfume rarely understood the full impact of their actions. For them, it was a small kindness, a way to ease the tension of occupation. Many of them were uncomfortable with the role of conqueror. They had been trained to fight, not to govern. Giving away perfume, or chocolate, or cigarettes was a way to humanize an awkward situation. It was also, perhaps, a way to reassure themselves that they were still the good guys, that the war had not turned them into something they did not recognize. But the gesture had consequences that rippled far beyond the individual exchanges. It became part of the narrative the Germans told themselves about the Americans, unlike the Soviet occupiers in the East, who requisitioned food and raped with impunity. The Americans were seen as relatively benign. This perception was not entirely accurate. American soldiers committed their share of crimes, and American policies in occupied Germany were often harsh, but the contrast with the Soviets was stark enough that many Germans came to see the Americans as liberators rather than conquerors. The perfume, along with the chocolate and the jazz music and the Marshall Plan aid, became part of the mythology of American benevolence. This mythology served American interests during the Cold War. West Germany became a crucial ally, a buffer against Soviet expansion. The friendship between the United States and West Germany was built, in part, on memories of those early encounters. The soldiers who shared their rations, the medics who treated German wounded, the officers who tried to be fair. The perfume, in this sense, was a small but significant investment in a geopolitical relationship that would define the second half of the 20th century. But to reduce the perfume to propaganda would be to miss its deeper significance. The bottles represented a genuine collision between two philosophies of power. Nazi Germany had believed that greatness came from will, from the ability to impose order on chaos through force and sacrifice. The United States, for all its flaws, operated on a different premise. That greatness came from freedom, from allowing people to pursue their own happiness and trusting that the aggregate of those pursuits would generate prosperity. The perfume was evidence that the American model, at least in terms of material production, had won, but it also suggested that prosperity and decency were not mutually exclusive, that a country could be powerful without being cruel. The nurses who received the perfume carried this lesson with them for the rest of their lives. In interviews conducted decades later, Many of them still remembered the moment vividly. One woman, speaking in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, said, "I had been taught to hate the Americans, but when that soldier gave me the perfume, I couldn't hate him. He was just a boy, far from home, trying to do the right thing. It made me realize that maybe the enemy was not who I thought it was." Another, interviewed in 2005, said, "The perfume was like a message in a bottle. It said, 'You are still a person, you still matter.' After everything I had seen, everything I had done, I needed to hear that." The symbolism of perfume, ephemeral, feminine, luxurious, was particularly potent in the context of war. War is the realm of the masculine, the brutal, the necessary. Perfume is the opposite, unnecessary, delicate, beautiful. To give perfume to an enemy nurse was to insist that even in the aftermath of total war, there was still room for beauty. It was a refusal to let the war define everything. It was a claim that civilization had survived, that the things worth fighting for, art, love, kindness, still existed. This claim was not universally accepted. Some American officers were furious when they learned their men were fraternizing with German women. Non-fraternization orders were issued and then ignored. Some military police tried to confiscate the perfume and other gifts, arguing that they were undermining discipline, but the soldiers kept giving and the women kept receiving, and the official policies slowly adapted to the reality on the ground. By the end of 1945, non-fraternization had been quietly abandoned. The perfume had won. The story of the perfume also intersects with the larger story of women in war. The German nurses were not passive victims. Many of them had been enthusiastic supporters of the Nazi regime. Some had joined the party. Others had turned a blind eye to atrocities or actively participated in them. The American soldiers who gave them perfume were not necessarily absolving them of guilt, but they were recognizing their humanity, insisting that even those who had been complicit in evil were still capable of change. This recognition was controversial then, and remains so now. How much forgiveness do the defeated deserve? How much generosity is too much? These questions haunted post-war Germany. The Nuremberg trials held the Nazi leadership accountable, but millions of ordinary Germans who had supported or enabled the regime escaped punishment. The perfume, in a sense, was part of that escape. It allowed both the Americans and the Germans to imagine a future in which they could coexist, in which the past could be acknowledged but not dwelt upon. This was both a strength and a weakness of the American approach to occupation. It allowed for reconciliation and rebuilding, but it also allowed for amnesia. Yet the perfume also carried a warning. It reminded the Germans that their worldview had been catastrophically wrong. The scarcity and discipline that the Nazis had glorified had led not to strength but to ruin. The abundance and freedom that they had been taught to despise had proven to be the basis of real power. Perfume was a gentle rebuke, a reminder that the future belonged to those who could produce and share, not those who could only conquer and hoard. This lesson resonated far beyond Germany. Throughout the Cold War, the United States used its material abundance as a weapon in the ideological struggle against communism. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe, was an extension of the logic of the perfume, that generosity could be strategic, that helping others could serve American interests. The Berlin Airlift, which kept West Berlin supplied during the Soviet blockade, was another example. Even the consumer goods that flooded into Western Europe, Coca-Cola, blue jeans, rock and roll, were part of the same strategy. They demonstrated that capitalism, whatever its flaws, could deliver the goods. The German nurses who received perfume in 1945 lived through all of this. They saw their country divided and rebuilt. They saw the economic miracle of the 1950s, when West Germany rose from the rubble to become one of the richest nations in Europe. They saw the Berlin Wall go up and then come down, and many of them, looking back, traced the arc of their lives to that moment in the field hospital, when an American soldier handed them a bottle and smiled. The perfume itself, the physical bottles, mostly did not survive. Some were used until empty. Others were broken during the chaos of post-war displacement. A few were kept as mementos and eventually donated to museums or passed down to children and grandchildren. In these cases, the bottles became relics, tangible links to a moment when history pivoted. Museum curators, interviewing the donors, often noted a common theme. The perfume had made the war feel, for the first time, like something other than an abstraction. It had made the enemy feel human. This humanization was not complete or universal. Plenty of Germans remained bitter bitter about their defeat, and plenty of Americans remained contemptuous of the Germans. But the perfume represented a possibility, a path not taken in earlier wars. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles had imposed harsh penalties on Germany, breeding resentment and setting the stage for Hitler's rise. After World War II, the Allies chose a different approach. They punished the leaders but invested in the people. The perfume was a microcosm of that choice. It is worth noting that this generosity was selective. The Americans were far more willing to forgive German nurses than, say, Japanese soldiers or Soviet partisans. Racism and Cold War calculations shaped who received kindness and who received punishment. The perfume in this sense was also a marker of privilege. The privilege of being European, of being female, of being seen as redeemable. This does not invalidate the gesture, but it complicates it. The same country that could give perfume to German nurses could also intern Japanese Americans or turn away Jewish refugees. Generosity and cruelty coexisted in the American character as they do in all nations. But within its limited context, the perfume achieved something remarkable. It broke the cycle of dehumanization that war demands. Soldiers are trained to see the enemy as less than human because killing humans is hard. The perfume, by treating the enemy as fully human, implicitly rejected that training. It said, the war is over, and now we must remember that we are all people. This was a radical act, even if the soldiers themselves did not think of it that way. The recurring image of the perfume bottle, small, fragile, easily broken, serves as a metaphor for the fragility of peace and decency in a world dominated by violence. The bottle could shatter in an instant, spilling its contents and leaving only the ghost of a scent. But as long as it remained intact, it held within it the possibility of beauty, of care, of a world where such things mattered. The nurses who clutched those bottles understood this implicitly. They had lived through years of ugliness and wanted desperately to believe that beauty was still possible. In the decades after the war, some of those nurses became advocates for peace and reconciliation. They spoke at schools and community centers, telling their stories to younger generations. They did not hide their involvement in the Nazi regime, but they also did not dwell on it. Instead, they focused on the moment of transformation, the moment when they realized that the enemy was not a monster but a human being. They held up the perfume as proof that even in the darkest times, kindness was possible. Others remained silent. The shame of having supported a genocidal regime was too great. They buried the perfume in the back of a closet and tried to forget. But the scent, faint but persistent, remained. Every so often, moving boxes or cleaning out a drawer, they would catch a whiff of jasmine or rose, and the memories would flood back. The American soldier with his easy smile, the tense smelling of disinfectant and rain. The moment when the world they thought they knew fell apart. The perfume also became a motif in literature and film. German authors grappling with the legacy of the war used it as a symbol of American generosity and German guilt. In Günter Grass's The Tin Drum, a minor character receives perfume from an American soldier and obsesses over it, unable to use it because doing so would mean accepting that the war is truly over. In films like Die Brücke and Deutschland and Jahr Null, similar scenes appear, moments of unexpected kindness that throw the characters' ideologies into disarray. Perfume became a shorthand for the moral complexity of occupation, for the idea that the victors were not purely good and the vanquished not purely evil. American writers and filmmakers were less interested in the perfume, perhaps because it did not fit neatly into their narratives of unambiguous triumph. The perfume suggested that the war had been won not just through superior firepower but through superior values, and that those values included compassion for the defeated. This was a less heroic story than the one told in films like The Longest Day or Patton, where the focus was on battlefield glory. But it was in some ways a more important story because it spoke to what came after the fighting stopped. The Cold War gave the perfume a new significance, as West Germany became an ally and East Germany fell behind the Iron Curtain. The contrast between the two Germanys was stark. West Germans, with their Marshall Plan aid and their integration into the Western economy, prospered. East Germans, under Soviet occupation, suffered through decades of scarcity and repression. Perfume, in this context, became a symbol of the road not taken. What if the Americans had been vindictive rather than generous? What if they had treated all of Germany the way the Soviets treated the East? The perfume suggested that generosity had been not just morally right, but strategically wise. This argument was not without its critics. Some historians pointed out that American generosity generosity was self-interested, designed to create a bulwark against communism rather than to heal the wounds of war. Others noted that the generosity extended to Germans was denied to others, particularly in the Third World where American interventions were often brutal. The perfume, they argued, was a kind of propaganda, a way to obscure the harsher realities of American power. These critiques had merit, but they did not change the fact that for the nurses who received the perfume, the gesture mattered. It changed how they saw the world and how they saw themselves. By the time the Cold War ended and Germany reunified, the generation of nurses who had received perfume in 1945 was aging. Many had passed away, but their children and grandchildren carried the story forward. In the 1990s and 2000s, as Germany grappled with its Nazi past through education and memorialization, the story of the perfume became part of the broader narrative of confronting history. It was a reminder that redemption was possible. People who had been complicit in evil could change. That the future did not have to be defined by the past. The perfume also entered the realm of memory and nostalgia. For some Germans, particularly those who had been children during the war, the perfume represented a lost world of innocence. They had vague memories of their mothers or aunts receiving gifts from American soldiers, of a time when the soldiers seemed like visitors from a magical land of plenty. These memories, filtered through decades, became tinged with a kind of melancholy. The perfume was a reminder of what had been lost, not just in the war, but in the decades of division that followed. For the Americans, the perfume became part of the mythos of the Good War. The idea that World War II had been a just and necessary conflict fought by a generation of heroes. The soldiers who gave away perfume were remembered as embodiments of American decency, men who fought hard but did not lose their humanity. This narrative, while not entirely false, was also not entirely true. It highlighted the complexities and contradictions of the war and its aftermath. But myths, even incomplete ones, have power. They shape how nations see themselves and how they act in the world. The physical bottles, those that survived, became collector's items. Auction houses occasionally featured them, often with labels reading, "Given by American soldier to German nurse, 1945. The prices varied depending on provenance and condition, but the historical value was always higher than the monetary one. These were not just bottles of perfume. They were artifacts of a moment when the world could have gone in a very different direction. In recent years, historians have begun to re-examine the story of the perfume with a more critical eye. They have asked who gave the perfume and who received it, and what those choices reveal about race, gender, and power. They have noted that the same soldiers who gave perfume to white German nurses often treated black German civilians or women of color with contempt. They have pointed out that the generosity extended to Germans was not extended to Japanese Americans, who remained in internment camps until late 1945. These critiques do not invalidate the story of the perfume, but they contextualize it, reminding us that no act of kindness exists in a vacuum. The perfume also raises questions about the nature of memory, how much of the story is true, and how much is being shaped by nostalgia and selective recall. Did the nurses really react with stunned silence, or is that a detail added later to heighten the drama? Did the soldiers really give away French perfume, or has that luxury item replaced more mundane gifts like soap and cigarettes in the retelling? These are difficult questions, but they matter. History is not just what happened, but how we remember what happened. And memory is always political. What remains undeniable is that something changed in those field hospitals in the spring of 1945. The nurses who had expected brutality encountered kindness. The soldiers who had been taught to hate encountered humanity. And in the space between expectation and reality, a new possibility emerged. That the war could end not in vengeance, but in reconciliation. That enemies could become, if not friends, then at least fellow human beings. The perfume, with its scent of jasmine and rose, carried that possibility forward. It lingered in the air of the field hospitals, in the drawers of post-war homes, in the memories of those who had been there, and it whispered across the decades a truth that is easy to forget, that in the midst of the worst humanity can do, there is still room for the best. April 17th, 1945, a German nurse stands in a field hospital near the Rhine holding a bottle of perfume. Outside, the rain has stopped, and the sun breaks through the clouds. The war is not yet over, but for her, in this moment, it feels as if it might be. She unscrews the cap and breathes in the scent, and for the first time in years, she allows herself to hope, not for victory or vindication, but for something simpler, the possibility that filled with the promise that the future, whatever it brings, does not have to be defined by the past. The perfume is a gift, but it is also a challenge to accept that the enemy was not who she thought, that the world was not what she believed, and that she, like her country, must find a way to live with that knowledge. In the end, the perfume is more than a symbol. It is a question. Can abundance and decency coexist? Can a nation be powerful without being cruel? Can people who have done terrible things still change, still grow, still deserve forgiveness? The nurses who received the perfume did not answer these questions definitively, but they lived them, day by day, year by year, until the bottles were empty and the scent was only a memory. And in living them, they became part of a larger story. The story of how sometimes, in the ruins of the old world, the seeds of a new one can take root. The perfume is gone now, evaporated into the air, leaving only traces of faint sweetness, a ghost of jasmine, a whisper of rose. But the lesson it carried remains, that even in the darkest times, small acts of kindness matter. That generosity is not weakness but strength, that the choices we make about how to treat our enemies define us more than the battles we win. And that sometimes, the most powerful weapon is not a bomb or a bullet, but a bottle of perfume given freely with a smile to someone who never expected it. This is the truth the perfume teaches, that freedom and abundance are not just economic conditions, but moral ones. That a society is judged not by how it treats its friends, but by how it treats its defeated foes. And that the line between barbarism and civilization is not drawn by ideology or ethnicity or power, but by the simple choice to see the humanity in others, even when, especially when they have been taught to deny yours. The German nurses learned this lesson in the spring of 1945, standing in a field hospital near the Rhine, holding bottles of perfume given to them by American soldiers. They learned it not through lectures or propaganda, but through experience. The experience of being treated with kindness when they expected cruelty, with generosity when they expected punishment, with humanity when they expected vengeance. And in learning it, they became witnesses to a different kind of victory. Not the victory of armies or ideologies, but the victory of decency over hatred, abundance over scarcity, hope over despair. The bottle is empty now. The sin has faded. But the memory endures, passed down through generations, a reminder that even in the aftermath of total war, beauty can still exist, that even among enemies, kindness is possible.